Within the context of the history of media, video games are still a relatively new form of entertainment, having reached mainstream popularity during the 70s and 80s, and the first piece of media to be considered a video game being invented in 1958, less than 70 years ago with William Higginbotham's Tennis for Two. There even exist still functioning vehicles today that are older than the entire history of video games. Unlike films, books, or other media types, video games haven't had decades or centuries of remaining in relatively one form. This short span of media history video games have encompassed has run parallel to an exponential increase in technological prowess, and games even one generation apart could feel completely different. And video games are a media which has taken on many different forms, branching into all sorts of different avenues during that time. As such, we haven't had one exact form of gaming for a long enough time to definitively say, this specific media is what gaming means. Rather, gaming encompasses a wide umbrella of different forms. This has made it difficult for academics to agree as of yet on the philosophical question as to whether games are an art form, or perhaps whether games under a certain type can be considered artful, while others not. But I would argue these are not the right questions to be asking. These questions often lead to a similar path. Many will create their own personal definition of art, demonstrate why a particular example adheres to this definition, and conclude that therefore games can be art, in an effort to further legitimize something of personal importance. Not to say these types of arguments aren't without merit, but they may struggle to change the mind of someone opposed to the idea of games as art. Rather than create my own personal definition of art and demonstrate why a certain game fits that vision, I would rather discuss some lenses by which many consider to be artful and why, and how video games can not only embrace this, but further enhance it to a degree not seen in other media by nature of the developer-player co-authorship in the experience of both play and narrative. Beginning with the artful nature of play, it may seem odd at first to consider play to be artful. After all, it is simply fulfilling game objectives in the manner the game developer expects in pursuit of fun, is it not? First, we must consider examples of what can be considered artful play outside of video games. Take Olympic gymnastics, for example. Anybody from the audience could walk up and swing around on the bars like a child on a playground, but this would not be considered a standout performance by any means. The technique and form is far from artful. One may manage to perform all the moves in a complicated gymnastics routine, but if it is accomplished in a feeble manner, one will not get a perfect score. Best argues that an aesthetic sport is one in which the purpose cannot be specified independently of the manner of achieving it. One might argue that such sports are so close to dance that they are plausible candidates to be called art forms. We obviously attribute such aesthetic qualities to particular playings of games, especially from the spectator's perspective. Sports spectatorship, for example, is full of talk of the beauty and elegance of athletic motion. Take chess competitions as another example, where there's often two prizes, one for the winner and one for the best game. Why would this be if we didn't consider there to be an aspect of artfulness towards the play of the game? Chess is highly emergent in its play. There exist more possible games of chess than there are atoms in the observable universe, and the odds of two games playing out exactly the same is slim. The outcomes of games being the same, though, remains countless. Black wins, white wins, or a draw. But if we only cared about the outcome, there wouldn't be a best game to celebrate. Rather, emphasis is placed on how the players got here, because we feel there's something worth celebrating, something artful about a perfect play, just the same as there's something jarring about an exceptionally poor play. While the outcome is the same, it's the journey, how well play is executed, that changes our experience. This is something shared across both sports
4-5-4 down lane, and look at this pin action. Oh.
And video games.
Happy feet, wombo combo. That ain't Falco. That ain't Falco.
There's nothing inherently artful about play without player action. Take strategy RPGs such as Fire Emblem, for example, which we may think of in a similar light to chess. Without any player input, all that exists is a map with units on it, and the countless possibilities for how the attempt to clear this level may go. An issue many academics take in the debate of games as art is that unlike other conventional media, the artist, or game designer in this case, is not handcrafting the exact experience they know each member of the audience will be subject to. Rather, they must take into account the emergence that comes with play, that is, the differences in play experience. The aspect of emergence in play does not create the distinction that video games cannot be art, but rather, it creates the distinction that the artist is not only the developer, but the developer and player. It is not the role of the developer to lay out exactly how everything will occur as in a film or book, but rather to lay the foundations for the possibility of artful play. A good map in a game like Fire Emblem will push the player to think outside the box, execute carefully thought out strategies, discover the weakness in what seemed before to be an impenetrable wall of foes, to engage in artful play. Fixing a broken car engine, figuring out a math proof, managing a corporation, even getting into a bar fight, each can have its own particular interest and beauty. These include the satisfaction of finding the elegant solution to an administrative problem, of dodging perfectly around an unexpected obstacle. These experiences are wonderful, but in the wild, they are far too rare. Games can concentrate those experiences. When we design games, we can sculpt the shape of the activity to make beautiful action more likely, and games can intensify and refine those aesthetic qualities, just as a painting can intensify and refine the aesthetic qualities we find in the natural sights and sounds of the world. What this looks like may be different from player to player, which is played into by aspects of games such as difficulty modes, or games that allow for various different mechanics the player can employ to make the game easier or harder for themselves, allowing players to select what direction they feel will create the greatest aesthetic experience for themselves.
Do you know how hard the difficulty settings on Metal Gear Solid 2 are?
Hard.
Hard? Would you recommend doing them or not doing them?
Yeah, bump them up.
Pump them up?
Yeah.
Okay, but I don't think I'm doing this though, the game over if discovered.
No, don't do that.
Yeah, I might pass on that there.
That one's a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
The beauty and artfulness of play is something celebrated within the gaming community. Take, for example, speedrunning, where skilled players display their mastery over a game by completing it in the shortest time possible. When new tricks or glitches are discovered, they're often shared among speedrunning communities, full of those who want to see the potential of these games pushed ever further and further. Outside of typical speedruns, we also have TASes, or tool-assisted speedruns, where inputs are typically handcrafted and refined in slow motion, and then set to play during a run of the game. The purpose of a TAS is to show the upper limit of potential for a game, past what a human would normally be able to achieve. True perfection for a game. For example, this is Minecraft beaten in 20 seconds. There also exist various speedrunning categories, such as low percent, where players strive to beat a game while completing as little of the game as possible, which results in runs like the 25-hour Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess run, where the players spend 17 hours staring at rupees. It is far from the fastest method to beat the game, but it is the method to beat it with the lowest completion. Non-video game players might be rather shocked to hear about 17 hours spent doing nothing because of what it achieves being an artful act to be celebrated, but the play remains a spectacle for countless players to behold. Speedruns, and by extension TASes, low percents, and other categories, have majorly taken off in gaming in the last couple decades due to the artful nature of well-executed play, and these types of play pushing the idea of well-executed play to its absolute limits. One of the key ways developers foster artful play can be found in Sakurai's definition of game essence. This was something brought up during the Scarlet and Violet video essay, but let's dive into it a bit deeper here and start by quoting one of his videos on the subject.
リスクを冒してリターンを得る。これがゲーム性、そして駆け引きの本質です。なお、攻略という要素にも大きく影響します。駆け引きとは立場が違う言葉で本質は同じ。ゲーム性はリスクを抑えてリターンを得るという楽しさのこと。攻略はリスクを抑えてリターンを得る工夫のこと。システム側とプレイヤー側の違いですね。
Sakurai sees game essence as the fun that comes with needing to take risks in pursuit of reward, an inherent push and pull relationship, such as needing to leave cover and spend a shiv to get into this room with valuable resources. Take, for example, Roller Coaster Tycoon. Your goal is to have a certain amount of guests in your park by a certain date, or having a certain park value, or other goal. To do this, you need to build and develop your park, and to do that, you need money. But the only way you can get more money is by spending money, or taking out loans that you eventually need to repay. Every time you build a new attraction, you're doing so with the hope that it will grant you a return on investment. You're taking a risk here, although you can strategize in such a way to reduce risk and increase reward by building attractions in high-traffic areas, or by building scenery around your ride park guests may enjoy. If you want to seek out the greatest reward, you must also incur the greatest risk by playing into the name of the game and building a roller coaster. A roller coaster is a massive investment that you could have put towards developing many smaller, safer investment rides, and will likely take a lot of in-game time to pay itself off, compared to the smaller rides that usually pay themselves off relatively shortly. Once it's paid off though, you'll be making a lot off of this attraction's success. You might even start generating more revenue from your other attractions in turn, as you may start getting more guests coming because they want to ride your coaster. In this way, you could say the action that reflects the highest risk and highest reward, the action with the greatest degree of game essence, is the thing in the very title of the game. Let's take some other examples. Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Immediately when the world is open to you, you can go and face dungeons with the bare minimum in terms of abilities. It may be a challenge to overcome with few hearts, stamina, and poor armor and equipment, but if you manage to see it through, you've now unlocked new abilities you can use for the entire rest of the game to make things like traversals so much easier, or giving you additional allies in combat like your sexy shark spirit animal. In Elden Ring, you can take on the challenges in a relatively linear order if you'd like, or perhaps you take a greater risk now that makes even smoother, less risky sailing in the future. When I played, I went straight on to tackle Margit and then Godric, which is probably roughly what the developers would expect. My little cousin, on the other hand, went straight to Florida, commonly seen as one of the most difficult, and if not, at least one of the most painful areas of the game, to nick himself some Scarlet Rot Wolf Spirit Ashes, and then came and cleaned up Godric in a matter of minutes, a boss that took me over 3 hours. He incurred a greater risk now, for the sake of reward in the form of less risk later, and in that way, co-authored his own experience through this aspect of Elden Ring's game essence. Taking risks like this and achieving a reward for your efforts is an integral part of the fun of games. Whether in video games or other activities, there is something artful about skillful and impressive play. A key focus in game design is to create an environment to foster the emergence of these artful moments of well-executed play. Well-designed games will play into this by embracing Sakurai's definition of game essence, by incentivizing players to take greater risks with the promise of greater reward, giving reason for players to engage in artful play to the degree they feel confident in achieving. If we did not believe there to be an inherent beauty to these displays of mastery and well-executed play, would we not simply care about the outcome and not the journey? Games turn out to be a way of writing down forms of agency, of inscribing them in an artifact. Games are among our techniques for inscribing and recording bits of human experience. We have developed methods for recording stories, novels, poetry, film, and other kinds of narrative. We have developed methods for capturing sights, drawing, painting, photography, and film. We have developed methods for capturing sounds, written music, recording technologies, and wooden duck calls. We have even developed methods for capturing sequences of action to be performed, cookbook directions, dance choreography, and stage directions. Games are a method for capturing forms of agency. Games are the art form of agency. The artful nature of narrative is something that differs in the realm of video games compared to other media as well, in the nature by which it draws audience emotion. Narrative in a video game is inherently different from other forms of storytelling, as it is one of the only forms by which the player is one of the characters, and the only form of doing this which I would argue can be considered mainstream. Therefore, there will always be an aspect of player agency in creating the narrative, whether that be by progressing a linear story through their actions, exploring a branching story based on their own choices and play, or even piecing together the story themselves, or perhaps even a combination of different storytelling formats. A linear story seems the most questionable for how exactly the narrative is co-authored, so that's what will be discussed, the ideas from which can still be applied into other narrative approaches. A linear story still remains the most handcrafted experience a video game can go for. The writer has a strong control over what it is the player is going to experience. However, it is still through the player's actions that the story is uncovered, by clearing the challenges presented to them as they assume the role of the playable character, which allows for storytelling possibilities not present in other media. We often hear it said that films can break the fourth wall through techniques such as directly addressing the audience, but the wall remains. It is ontologically impossible for the audience of a film to break the wall. Video game technology has allowed artists to experiment with solutions to the problem of how to make an interactive movie. Video games are the first con-creative mass art. Video games can embrace having the player mentally place themselves into the shoes of the character they play as. For example, in Firewatch, we begin in a text-adventure game style as we learn of the playable character, Henry's, story. We are presented options that seemingly shape the outcome of his life, such as what kind of dog to get. Ultimately, these choices change next to nothing, but it imbues in the player a sense of agency and control over Henry's life, that we are no longer a member of the audience of the story, but rather an active part of it, as Henry and we are one and the same, which is then reflected in the emotions we feel during play, that would not be present were we simply an audience member.
They wish I was over there. It'd be nice to be near somebody.
We see a similar idea in Persona 5, where we have several different dialogue options throughout the game, almost all of which will affect nothing, but imbue the player with a sense that this character they're controlling on the screen is them. That means this cast of characters on screen aren't just Ren's friends, but yours as well in an inadvertent way. And so you want to see right done by these digital figures. In a video game, this idea of placing yourself into the hero can be reflected to an even further degree by creating a parallel between the gameplay and the narrative, known as ludonarrative harmony. Take, for example, games with narratives where the hero loses something vital, and this is reflected in gameplay. Xenoblade Chronicles 2, one of your most powerful party members is taken. Now it's up to our heroes, and by extension the player, to defeat some of the hardest bosses in the game without her. Fire Emblem Engage, you've been gradually getting more powerful as you obtain new emblem rings, until they're all taken by the main antagonist, and now with our power stripped, we are given the task of escape, in what is, in my opinion, one of the most difficult levels of the game. Watch Dogs, we spend the game going around hacking whatever we see fit.
Shit. Okay, don't panic. There's gotta be a
But at the end, the tables are turned as our foe gains control, and while before the world was subject to the whims of our hacks, we are now subject to the whims of our foes' hacks. All of these games raise the stakes in both narrative and gameplay by taking away something players are expected to have become reliant on to this point, and now the dread the hero feels in the game may too be the dread the player feels in real life. One especially strong example of this is Metal Gear Solid 2, which quite literally strips the hero to nothing and faces the player off against a long hallway full of foes, with the promise our equipment is being held on the other side by a character we no longer know whether to consider friend or foe. It's a section meant to instill a sense of powerlessness in the hero, and by extension, the player, which the game further expands on by utilizing the player as a character.
Raiden, turn the game console off right now.
What did you say?
The mission is a failure. Cut the power right now.
What's wrong with you?
Don't worry, it's a game. It's a game just like usual.
What comforting action might the player still have here in such a situation? Saving. That remains in our control. The game does allow saving, but doing so results in dialogue further implying that things are not as they seem and something is coming, further instilling a sense of unease. Video games can serve as an avenue to explore more personal emotions in the sense that events playing out are indirectly occurring to the player in a way, which is also due to the game's unpredictability. Were a character in a movie put into a tense situation, the tension is not as high, as we know the outcome has already been predetermined, even if we don't know what it is. We simply need to sit back and watch to be entertained and find out what happens, as opposed to there being the possibility of either success or failure, determined by our actions and ability to adapt to the situation we've been placed in. Through the exploration of ludonarrative harmony, and games' ability to allow players to insert themselves indirectly into the story, I would argue video games are capable of evoking more personable emotions than that of other media. Even in a completely linear story, in a video game, we can be imbued with a sense of agency and responsibility for the narrative we experience. The player can experience this narrative on a more personable level, not detracting from the artistic vision of the designer, but rather further enhancing it when done right. It doesn't feel like the writer is sharing a handcrafted story, but rather feels like we, the player, our playable character, and the writer are crafting this experience together, sharing the hypothetical brush in co-authoring art, both through the creation of artful play and truly immersive narrative. Critics of the notion that games can be art will often claim that the reason games cannot be art is because they don't adhere to an exact final product a designer or artist envisions. By nature of being a video game, and therefore allowing for emergent outcomes, the designer cannot know the exact outcome of their work, as it may differ for each individual player, and this does not allow them to execute a specific artistic vision. But this should not be seen as something that inherently detracts from the experience. On the contrary, it can add to it, by inviting further exploration of the game, and for players to share their own experiences. Take, for example, Telltale's The Walking Dead, where events may play out differently depending on player choices. It's impossible to see every possibility on a first playthrough, at least without a mind-numbing level of save scumming. But does this mean that the experience is detracted from by essentially missing out on content and part of what the developers crafted? On the contrary, this plays into the idea of the immersive narrative. It is not geared to feel like we've been duped out of content we'd otherwise get, but rather, by assuming the role of Lee, there exist consequences to our actions, as we make our way through a world without the luxury of being able to do right by everybody. This is an integral part of this game's aesthetic experience. Each experience is shaped by the developer and that respective player, and these changes in experience based on that player's own decisions can be fascinating to explore as well. When this game first released, I remember watching several different content creators' playthroughs, intrigued to see how each of their differences in decision-making shaped the narrative. When I streamed a full playthrough of this game, I would sometimes have members of my stream make comments, such as having no idea certain options or dialogue were possible, getting to see sides of characters they hadn't seen before, creating value in the emergence of difference in experience, and in the sharing of these possibilities.
Drop it into the water. These two are actually jerks. Okay, bye.
Take another example, Sly 2: Band of Thieves. I had played a lot of PC games from a young age, such as Roller Coaster Tycoon, but this was my first ever home console game growing up. As a kid, I completed the tutorial, the world was open to me, and I had no idea there was an objective marker on the map I could go to progress the story. I spent weeks, if not months, running around defeating enemies and collecting coins, as I thought it was all the game was. I eventually discovered the objective marker, and was hit by a sense of wonder at the discovery that there was a story and missions to experience in this world I'd been exploring. Was this play experience the vision the studio behind the game had intended? Most likely not. But does it invalidate the possibility of classifying Sly 2 as art? I don't see why it would. Most would likely consider this to be poor play that differed too far from the vision of the game, but it was still meaningful to me, and if it's meaningful to each individual player, then it's achieved its purpose as a game, right? So, good video games are good for your soul when you play them with thought, reflection, and engagement with the world around you. They are good if, as a player, you begin to think and act like a game designer while you play the game, something good games encourage. After all, players co-author games by playing them, since if the player doesn't interact with the game and make choices about what will happen, nothing will happen. If the player utilizes the tools given to them by the developer to design their own personally meaningful experience, then I would argue that is an artful use of the medium, a means of engaging in good play, even if the player is the only one who feels so, and even if it differs from what the designer would have expected. However, there are countless video game players who would agree with the idea that by allowing emergent play, it undermines the artistic nature of a video game. Take, for example, Undertale, when this game started gaining major mainstream popularity. Content creators would play and allow the experience to take shape based on their own decisions, and proceed to be bullied and pushed by viewers who felt they were playing the game incorrectly, feeling that the content creator was not going to be subject to the artistic vision of the game because they made their own choices, rather than the choices most considered to be correct by the community. Take Elden Ring as another example, including countless mechanisms to allow the player to tailor their own experience. And the Lord said, "Let there be beam!" Not playing in a manner some players expect you to, though, and backlash was to be expected.
Man, this game is so fucking sick, bro. I can't wait to see.
Soulsborne titles, and especially Elden Ring, were met with this gatekeeping elitism by players who sought to accept only those who adhered to what they believed to be the true artistic vision of the game, and shun and gatekeep those who do not. But if the player themselves feels they are engaging in artful play, that's all that truly matters. Who's to tell them otherwise? While it's true that by the allowance of emergent play by means of a video game, there is no guarantee the experience will be exactly as the game designer intends, this does not invalidate the possibility that games can be art, but rather grants video games their own unique artfulness, by creating opportunity for individual players to engage in artful play in an experience given form by their own actions.
I'm so confused.
It is important to note, though, games are not some infallible artistic medium. While I would argue that gamers playing in their own way, thinking like a game designer and that they are designing their own experience, only further enhances the artistic nature of the video game, I would also argue there are factors that do diminish the artistic nature and player experience of video games in terms of how the game is designed. Let's first discuss an example where I believe this to not be the case. Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 and 2 from 1999 and 2002 respectively. These games were primarily made by one person, Chris Sawyer, along with a graphic designer and sound designer and composer. In an email I received from the graphic designer, Simon Foster, in response to my video essay on Roller Coaster Tycoon, where I described the original games as a work of passion before falling into near obscurity due to corporate decisions, he had this to say on the subject. The phrase, work of passion, summed it up nicely. Chris loved the game, and had a very clear idea of where he wanted it to go. During development, I must have suggested hundreds of ideas to him, of which he maybe adopted one or two, with always a good reason as to why the idea was rejected. In that way, he kept a sharp focus, and his aim was to make a game he would love to play, and worry about how it would be sold later. I think the original games were a very good example of how the enlightened despotism of one person, with a sidekick doing the graphics and a sound guy who was talented, wins out every time over design by a committee which, I imagine, is being badgered by the marketing department. Best you can hope for in that case is something that offends no one. If a camel is a horse designed by committee, maybe some other games are a kludge made by a group who understood the bank balance a lot better than the fun you can have with a game like Roller Coaster Tycoon. What Foster is saying here is that Sawyer stayed tunnel vision towards making the ideal video game that he wanted to play. He had a specific vision and saw it through. Clearly, this worked, establishing Roller Coaster Tycoon as one of the big simulation IPs of the time. Everyone's theme parks they crafted may have looked a little different. Each player could co-author their own artful experience using the tools given to them, and how they balance the push and pull, the risk and reward, of the game essence. Compare that to the direction Atari has taken RCT since 2012. These games are all about using the tools available to you to build whatever amusement park you see fit. So do you know what seems like a great idea? Let's put a limit on how many of any given thing you can build. Once you hit that limit, if you want to build more, you better demolish some of your other work. Next title. How fun would it be if you wanted to build something, and you're met with a wait wall before it's completed, with the option of completing it now by using in-game purchases, something characteristic of freemium apps, except it wasn't when it first launched. The freemium app, that is. It cost $5 to install in the first place. The next title. Finally, the next big PC Roller Coaster Tycoon game. The next installment in the form fans wanted. Except the final product turned out barely functional, with players encountering frequent crashing, unfunctional or clunky mechanics, poor UI, jarring graphics, and an overall aesthetic that felt so far from the original games it was based on. There would be some other titles from there, such as another freemium mobile app, a Nintendo Switch title that just copy-pasted the engine and changed the format of the app under the guise of a new original game being crowdfunded, where investor funds probably weren't even used on the game. And another freemium app, this time copying Candy Crush, which itself copied Bejeweled, and had almost nothing to do with RCT anymore. And it seems this pattern continues to this day. It's not to say that it's impossible to co-author an artful experience between player and developer in these types of environments, but rather that the potential for artfulness is undermined. To co-author is to think like a game developer, only in these environments, there's a cap put on what you can develop. Either wait or pay the development fine. What you're developing might not even function. What you have the potential to develop feels shallow compared to what you once had. Or perhaps what you're developing doesn't even remotely resemble the work you were passionate about co-authoring in the first place. In the modern gaming industry, it's not always in studios' best interest to pursue the greatest aesthetic experience, as the industry has proven it's no longer what's most profitable. For example, Elden Ring took 5 years to develop, and in its first year sold over 20 million units, an impressive feat within the gaming industry, and yet this generated less revenue than the freemium game Genshin Impact makes in 1 year. Or take Tales of Arise, a quite ambitious video game that sold over 2 million units, which was an impressive feat to be celebrated. But compare that to the profitability of some of these other titles, and is it really any surprise this single-player game ended up being as disgustingly monetized as it did? For another example, I'll quote one of my video essays from a couple years ago.
Let's look at Red Dead Redemption, for example. Red Dead 1 sold approximately 15 million in its lifetime, while Red Dead 2 has sold over 30 million copies. That sounds like it made so much more revenue, right? Well, take into account that Red Dead 1 was made in just over 5 years by over 800 people with a budget of 80 to 100 million, and Red Dead 2 was made in over 8 years by over 1,600 people with a budget of 379 to 500 million. Which one of these games truly made more revenue? I'm no economics expert, it could well still be Red Dead 2, but not by as much as the sales numbers may initially suggest. What if it sold worse than Red Dead 1, however? There's so much greater risk being incurred here for if something goes wrong.
Much like video games themselves, the gaming industry holds risk and reward as a very integral aspect. Investing in so much more resources and funding may well lead to greater reward, or perhaps not. It is a far greater risk.
Ubisoft Belgrade. Ubisoft Berlin. Holy shit, no! There's a lot of Ubisoft that worked on this. I mean, after 9 years, how long does it go on? Dear God! How many Ubisoft studios did they need to get this finished?
In the modern media industry, risk is typically seen as something evil that should be reduced as much as possible. It's why personal information is such a valuable resource to be sold nowadays, as producers want to market to those who have the highest likelihood of being interested to minimize their risk as much as they can. A big risk in developing a video game while investing many company resources, while it does come with a high ceiling of reward potential, it's always possible that it may just turn into a flop and money pit. So why invest all these resources into one massive gamble when you can distribute resources across multiple smaller projects that are industry proven to do pretty well? Why strive to make a game that could be a 10 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 when you can consistently push out 6 out of 10s or 7 out of 10s that will always be generating revenue? And so we see many game IPs staying consistent with either themselves or other successes in the industry. Take another example I used in my video essay on historical video games. If a video game is portraying the historical event of D-Day, is this truly an attempt at recreating D-Day? Or is it an attempt at recreating Saving Private Ryan? Why take a risk with creating something new and original, or outside of the entertainment sphere norm, when we can copy other proven successful media and portrayals? Design by committee will most often rule towards developing what's safest, rather than what's most unique.
企画時に多くの人が否定的に捉える仕様が実際に作ってみたら面白かったなんてことはザラにあります。メタルギアソリッド3で怪我をしてそれを直すという企画が立てられた時、スタッフ内で賛成した人はたったの4人だったと聞きました。同作の完成版をプレイした人なら不具合を良くするという面白さは理解できるはず。多数決で上がるものというのは一番無難ということです。つまり平凡だということ。
The artful nature of developer-player co-authorship only has as much potential as the developer provided tools and opportunity for the player to co-author an artful experience. You can almost think of it like the player is the artist actually putting everything together. The developer is the one providing all the tools, the canvas, the framework, and guidance. There are cases where the developer has a specific artistic vision they're interested in sharing with the player, embarking on this artistic journey together, or lays the framework for the player to craft an artful experience that's uniquely their own. But there are also cases where the developer takes away your paintbrushes and gives you crayons. If you want to see or manage your paintbrushes, that'll be a subscription service. If you want to actually use some of your paintbrushes again, that'll cost you a different canvas, even though previously you've had the option to use any of your paintbrushes on the one canvas. Also, you've just fallen through the canvas. Perhaps one developer creates a canvas that's so big it takes up the entire studio, so you no longer have any room for other canvases, to disincentivize you from being a part of other art. Maybe one developer puts your paintbrushes behind a gacha machine, and will from time to time let you get a pull for free, at which point you can paint on the canvas with whatever you end up getting, but frequently moving in close to you and whispering in your ear where you can get more paintbrushes if you give them some money. You might even have a chance of claiming an elusive 5-star paintbrush, and there's only a few more days this one is available, so if you don't get it soon, you'll have missed your chance forever. Some developers might notice that your painting is coming together a little slowly, due to the increased difficulty of using the brushes they weighted, so they offer you opportunities to have certain parts of the canvas finished just like that, as long as you give them a little money. Perhaps a super critically acclaimed canvas finally comes in a format that you can experience it, which seems at first like it'll be the same canvas that artists on the other format experienced. Only you find out there's all these smudges all over the canvas, and your hand mysteriously loses its ability to paint sometimes, and then the canvas explodes and causes the roof of your studio to collapse. Maybe the developer seems to imply that everything you purchase will be on this canvas, only when you purchase it, to roll in all these U-Haul trucks and start unloading things that take up major space in your studio. Perhaps a piece of artwork you've crafted is an immensely beautiful piece you want to share, but the developer tells you, do that and we will copyright strike you and take down your work immediately, so don't you dare think about sharing this with anyone else. Perhaps this one canvas has all sorts of unlockable brushes and colors, but they're all time-exclusive unlocks. You need to paint enough before a certain date to get them. Maybe the developer wants to start making a return on their investment before the canvas is ready, and so they put out this canvas while it's still just some loose fabric and some sticks, causing players to struggle with making something of what they've received, with the developer promising, we'll definitely fix it later. I could go on, but I think you get the point. There are countless practices that undermine the potential for players to craft an artful experience. Not to say that it's impossible. A talented or determined enough artist can potentially still craft a breathtaking piece with only crayons and a tattered piece of paper, but most probably won't have the skill, determination, or even just raw time investment required to see it through. Not only do these designed-by-committee projects gravitate towards what is the safest, and therefore most mediocre, but as is brought up by Foster, that committee is probably being badgered by a marketing department, ensuring as little risk is taken as possible while leaning into industry-proven profitable practices. It's no wonder that many gamers are tiring of big AAA video games, and that indie games are continuing to grow in popularity, as these are often still projects of a small team executing an artistic vision of the game they want to play.
So I was on winter break in my junior year of college, and was bored as hell, and was Googling games like Fire Emblem and not finding anything I wanted to play. And I was like, you know what, why don't I just make the game I want to play? And here we are. Two and a half years later, still not done.
Not to say that there aren't still games taking risks with new brushes their longtime players haven't painted with before, but it's not exactly standard practice. In conclusion, games are the art form of agency, in which the developer and player co-author the experience through player action and choice. It is the role of the developer to lay the foundations for the possibility of artful play, to create these moments of beauty that arise from the player's abilities to overcome the challenges presented to them, and balance risk and reward. Games are capable of immersing players by removing them from the audience and placing them into the story, allowing for higher stakes when success or failure depends on the player's abilities, and for more personable emotions as events playing out indirectly occur to the player in turn. Some might feel that the emergent nature of video games may undermine the artistic vision of the game, but on the contrary, if the player is able to think like a game developer in designing their own aesthetic experience through the tools the developer provides, that is an artistic use of the medium. However, It is possible that what the developer provides may be found lacking, often due to reducing risk or production requirements to increase average revenue, diminishing the ceiling of potential for co-authoring an artful aesthetic experience. This is what I feel sums up games as art. Of course, this says nothing about other aspects of games which can be seen as artful. Over the past couple months, whenever I told somebody the essay I was working on covered the topic of games as art, I would often get similar responses. Well, yeah, there's lots that could be artful about games, like some game graphics are pretty amazing. The arguments that games make can be really meaningful. Games can tell really great stories, game soundtracks can be so beautiful, and these are all things that I agree with can be works of art in their own way. Like other media, games could have an absolutely outstanding story, or they could have whatever this is. A game's soundtrack could be absolutely out of this world, or perhaps it has some cool aspects but lacks a strong presence in the overall game experience. Or, let's be honest, maybe it just straight up sucks. If it seems odd aspects such as these were not discussed in this essay, it's because these potentially beautiful aspects are not exclusive to the format of a video game, and the focus of the essay was on what is uniquely artful about a video game. Sure, some aspects like these can still make or break a game, or potentially undermine or enhance the artful co-authorship of the experience that is a video game, but the same thing could be said for enhancing or detracting from the artfulness of other media through these aspects. It's not something uniquely video game-like, but rather media-like. So while these are topics that are worth further analysis, I felt they did not relate enough to the topic of identifying video games' unique artfulness, and it was not the place to discuss it in this essay. I would argue, video games can achieve these artful aspects and more, and the focus of this essay was specifically on the "and more" part. But I would love to hear your opinions on the matter. Can video games be art? Why or why not? And what is it to you about video games that does or does not make them artful?
Didn't know The Last of Us was Cyberpunk 2077 collab. Yeah, it's an amazing collaboration. Whoa! Ah! Maybe I'll actually switch my team around before the next battle. Whoa! Whoa!